So as mentioned earlier on, the webinar will be recorded and the slides will be made available. So what's your agenda today? Our agenda is looking at the carbon border adjustment mechanism, or CBAM, and we'll look at two sides to it. We'll look at the EU and UK side, and we'll look at the concept, timeline, how it works, the mechanisms and the obligations, and the answer from the UK to the EU regulations and the impact that regulation will have on the UK and what is the UK doing about it and their own timeline. So that's the agenda for today. So if we look at the carbon border adjustment mechanism, what's the concept? What's the idea behind it? So what you've got at the moment in the EU is industries are, I'm looking for my pointer. Industry are currently, paying an ETS in Europe to compensate for their CO2 emissions. In countries outside Europe, they may or may not be paying any ETS. Therefore, they would appear cheaper. But they're cheaper because there is no ETS. So what the EU is doing is they are planning to put in place a CBAM certificate. So when the importer comes in, then there will be a tax, in a sense, on their product to put them into parity with the product made in Europe. So that's the concept of CBAM, is to, if you want, align competitiveness between EU products and non-EU products. What is the timeline? So in Europe, CBAM, in 2026, next year, you'll have your emissions. And to compensate for those emissions, company will need to share some CBAM surrounding. They may also, as part of CBAM, if some taxes or costs have been paid in the third country before they import, and it is recognized by the EU, then that will be discounted. And then they'll have to give away or surrender their CBAM certificate. And in 2026, they allocated a number of certificates at no cost. And that number of certificates is going to decrease because that's a free allowance, and it's going to decrease from 26 to 2030. And by 2034, it'll be gone. So by 2034, 100% will be made either by what is paid in third country before it arrives in Europe, or by the importer themselves. So one of the key differences in CBAM is the importer, which is responsible, and not the exporter. So it's a EU-based, company which would be responsible. And that was due because of a WTO challenge in the past. So what is the mechanism? So here are the stakeholders. You've got the supplier. As I said, you've got the EU importer, which is a declarant. You've got the custom authorities. You've got the European authorities, and you've got the country authorities. Those are all the key stakeholders. And the way that happens, so the EU importer imports some CBAM goods. By importing them, they need to do two things. One is, pardon me, they lodge with the custom authority, to clear the imports. So they've got the paperwork and all the details, including the CN numbers. And they need also to submit a quarterly report to European Commissions on their CBAM, what they've imported, the CBAM product, the CBAM goods. Then the custom authority will import also the European Commissions, and the two should be matching. That's the idea behind it. Then there is an exchange with the competent authority of each country, EU country, and that's who they be talking to and letting them know that's what has been imported. And then the local authority or the national authority and the EU importer in the nation considered will exchange certificates, and if it doesn't work, there is a possibility of penalties. Where that matters to us is here, because for the EU importers to be able to provide all the information, they're going to be asking their supplier, i.e. the UK, for example, anybody in the UK, for their specific embedded emissions. So what is the embedded emission in a product, the CBAM goods they brought in Europe? Ideally, they want to use a template which has been given to them by Europe, but it doesn't have to be. So that's the process, and that's where we come in. So what are the CBAM obligations? So what we've got at the moment is a regulation, and that's a regulation called the Regulation on Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, 2023/956. The fact it's a regulation and not a directive is quite significant. A directive is a minimum requirement. The country can do what they want as long as they don't go below the minimum. A regulation needs to be applied by each country as is by the later. So it is the regulations. There is a regulation which is currently a moving target, and they are proposing amendments. And one of them is for a derogation for all the goods listed in Annex 1 of that directive, if they do not exceed 50 tons per year. So currently it's 150 euros per consignment. So it is changing quite a bit. They are moving now to 50 tons, and they reckon by doing that, they basically they're going to remove about 91% of small SMEs. Now it's 50 tons per importer, of a CN good or a good by the CN code. Therefore, it could be more than one supplier. So it's just not 50 tons for the exporter, it's 50 tons for the importer. That may be made of several suppliers. But as long as they stay below that, they are excluded. Now, in terms of reporting deadline, they are also looking at moving that. And the first reporting will be in 2027, in August 31st by 2027, and that will be for the year 2026. So there is time, but that's why you probably start to get requests from your customers because they want to be ready by then. So they are making sure they've got their duck lined up. And you want to think about how much contribute to that 50 tons, because you may simply not qualify and not be excluded from it. Now, if you look at the applicability, so you've got the regulations, and the first question is you go to Annex 1 of the regulations, and is the goods you're supplying the good CN code in there in Annex 1? Because if it isn't, well, the regulation simply doesn't apply, and that's the CN code based on the EU regulation. But if it is, then the next question is, does it meet the de minimis threshold? So that's what we've just talked about it. And at the moment, it's 150 euros per consignment, but they want to change that to 50 tons per year per importer. So if it doesn't meet it, then no worries, the regulation doesn't apply. But if it does meet it, then you need to look at the greenhouse gas to be considered. And again, it's in Annex 1 of the regulations. And the reason for that is in some cases, like those CN codes, it's only carbon dioxide, CO2. But in other cases, it could be CO2 plus other greenhouse gases. So you've got example like nitrous oxide or perfluorocarbon, and that CO is known as CO2e. So that's what the Annex 1 gives you. First of all, is it there? And then if it is, then what gas are to be included or not. And then if you look at it's in there, so it applies, the next is you go to Annex 2, right? And it's a good code, and the reason you're doing that is because if it is, then it excludes indirect emissions. But if it isn't, then it does include indirect emissions. Now, here's a confusing bit, because for indirect emissions in the language you normally use is anything with scope 3, which is known as scope 3 in the greenhouse gas protocol, but not in this case. in this case, indirect emission only refer to electricity, scope 2. So that's what you have to do. So you may or may not include indirect emissions. So another annex you want to see, and it's all based on the CN code. And that's what I mean by the source of confusions here. You've got your precursors, without being indirect, because precursor, that's what you will be. You'll be sending parts to Europe, and so therefore you will be seen as a precursor supplier by the EU importer, and they will be looking at that as indirect emissions, but it's not excluded. So that's the role or the importance of Annex 2. Now, how do you calculate all that? So what they want is finding out what are the specific embedded emissions in the precursor in what you supply. So first of all, is what you supply, is it a simple good? If it is, then the specific embedded emissions are the attributed emission of that good, G, divided by the activity level.
Did they say the slides are going to be made available?
Sorry? Correct. So the attributed emission divided by the activity level. And those attributed emissions are the direct emissions and the indirect emissions. So the reason they are in orange is, remember, they may or may not be included as a function of their presence in the annex. And your direct emission is what people refer normally to scope 1, which is your production process emissions. Your indirect emissions, as I mentioned, will be your scope 2. And then you've got your activity level, which could be things like parts or weights or quantities or kilogram of goods, for example. Now, if it isn't a simple good, then it is a complex good, because it can't be anything else but simple or complex. And as in a complex good, it's exactly the same calculation plus the embedded emission in the input material. And those embedded emission in input material is what's in the precursors, and it is what you're going to be asked to supply. That's what they are interested in, because we are obviously now outside Europe. Therefore, that's what they want to find out. And they look at the determination methods, and they are providing something, a guideline, if you want, or that any EN or ISO standards will be acceptable. So in ISO, in the past, I talked about 14064, you got 14068. So there's plenty in the 40,000 series that would give you that sort of guideline on how you measure your emissions and how you account for it. So that's the way the embedded emissions are calculated. And this is the part, that embedded emission, that they're going to be interested from product coming from the UK. So how they're going to calculate those calculations, how they're going to do the calculation, how they're going to find out how many of those obligation certificates they need to surrender. So they start by the actual embedded emissions. So that's what's coming from the UK. So that would be in ton of CO2 per ton, for example. Then they're going to get their free allocations. That's what I mentioned about, but that's theirs. They've been allocated, so it's nothing to do with us. The amount of good, again, that's the EU importer, which is responsible for tracking how many goods is imported, with the 50 tons probably to be CMDB edition, so 50 tons is likely to be the next bit, the next de minimis, if you want, around 150 euros. And they'll be responsible for that. As I mentioned earlier on, the responsibility is on the importer. Then you've got the price of the certificate, and as dictated by the EU ETS, because the CBAM is aligned with the EU ETS, which is an auction system. And I give you the CBAM obligations. Now, what is of importance is the carbon price paid abroad is subtracted from that. So if you work or provide a product which has been, already subject to some carbon pricing, and that a system is agreed and approved by the EU, then you can subtract that. So that from a CBAM point of view, that makes your product cheaper if you want, because they don't have to surrender any of their certificates for that. So the problem is, right, so UK ETS pricing paid by UK Steel could potentially qualify, right? But that's going to have to be confirmed by Europe. And at the moment, they diverge. So you can see in blue here is the UK ETS is a lot cheaper than the EU ETS. And that's pretty due to free allocation, because there are also free allocations in the UK as part of the UK ETS. And that means that they are not linked. So because they are not linked, then that's why you need to go through that process. So what is the impact on the UK of CBAM? Well, the impact is going to be substantial on both sides. If I look at the European side, you can see here, and that was back in 2022, you know, the UK was the third country that the EU imported. So a big supplier to the EU, the UK, and probably going to go even bigger now that there's probably some issue with Russia, you know. So that's big as far as the EU is concerned. As far as the UK is concerned, it's also big because 80% of the CBAM product, UK CBAM product, are shipped to Europe. So it is a big market. So the impact is going to be substantial, and substantial on both sides. So the outcome from that is the UK government thought, okay, let's have a UK CBAM. And why do they want a UK CBAM? So, as I said, you know, the regulation applies to good, right, except when it's already to carbon pricing, which is fully linked with the EU ETS. And that's the big piece about it. Now, the UK, as I've showed you, which are diverging now in terms of pricing, are not fully linked today. But if they were, then that's where you would then end up with something that didn't apply. Now, as I said, you know, 2030, you've got that free allowance, which is decreasing, coming to zero by 2034, which means that everything will have to be either paid by the importer, the certificate, or the price paid in a third country prior to import. And that's where UK CBAM comes, because what the UK wants is basically have a piece of that cake, and they are just to make sure they're getting some revenue. If they've got a CBAM, then that money, instead of going to Europe, will be going to the UK. So that's the rationale for a UK CBAM. Now, what is the timeline for a UK CBAM? So in terms of similarities, if you want, so it's the same sectors than the EU CBAM. Of particular interest to us are aluminium, iron, and steel sectors. And it's also equivalent in terms of what you need to report, you know, similar completely. So you've got your direct emission, which is scope 1, your indirect emission, which is scope 2, and the precursor, which is scope 3. So that's what you have, and that's the similarities. However, there is a difference. So the UK ETS and the EU ETS are not the same, as we've seen, in terms of pricing. So they diverge. So they are not fully linked. And there is also the de minimis, the minimum threshold is different, because it is £50,000 for the UK. It is 50 tonnes for Europe. So there are still some difference that will need to be discussed and argued before the UK CBAM is recognized by the EU, and therefore the regulation becomes obsolete or non-applicable. So that's the challenge. But the plan is still to have a UK CBAM to apply by the 1st of January 2027. Now, there is a consultation going on at the moment there was a consultation already about the need for a CBAM, and that was last year in 2024, and resulted in a draft legislation, which be found here. And now there is a consultation on the draft legislations, which is closing in July. So if you want to participate and provide feedback, that's where you do it, and that's by when you need to do it. It's looking at a whole range of topics, and there is 14 of them. The one I think that are worth considering are registration, because that's how you need to provide information on who within the organization is doing the registrations, and you need a responsible person. There is weight measurements, because that's going to be key to make sure that the weights are accurate. And the records is nothing new. If you're doing anything with ISO being 40,000, 9,000 or 50,000, any ISO, you have to keep records. An interesting one is on group treatment, which is about when you are part of a bigger group and who, like maybe outside the UK corporation, so a corporation that has facilities in the UK but is not UK based. So those are the type of area you may want to look at and provide feedback if you wish to do so. So what are the takeaway for today? So ETS, emission trading scheme, is about addressing emissions. So it's a polluter pays, basically. CBAM is about addressing competitiveness. It's to make sure that there is a fair price or a comparable price between the product that come from within the country, in this case, the EU, the UK, versus...
See up behind the right, the trucks off the road.
Hello.
Don't know.
Mute, please.
Road, doing again. Ask CCS.
Can you please go on mute? Thank you. So that's the CBAM addresses. So it's two different things, right? They are based on each other because CBAM certificate prices are related to ETS, but they address two different things. Now, the EU ETS and the EU CBAM are in place. So it's slightly being targeted with omnibus editions, but they are in place, they are operational, and they are aligned, so they are ready to go. The UK ETS is in place, but the UK CBAM isn't. But they are planning to implement it by 2027. So it's not a case of if it's going to happen, it's when it's going to happen. And then for your information and the support we provide, we've got a CBAM folder in our net zero library, which is available here in one of your or if your website or microsite. So where you find all the training. So that's the summary today about CBAM. So I would like to thank you all for taking the time to come and listen to me this morning. And I would like to open the floor for any question you may have on CBAM.
Good morning, Eric. Who do you think should facilitate the CBAM in terms of the reporting and the management of it? I mean, is it a health and safety function? Is it a finance function? Shipping? Who do you think should manage it?
So it usually fall under ESG, right? So, but who should manage it? I think is who's the most knowledgeable about it, and who you decide to train. So who would it be? Because everybody will have to have an input. So you will need financial information, but I'm not sure it's the financial side. I would say it's probably rated to whoever is the facility manager, maybe, who manage the facilities. What you're trying to do is having one information for everybody. So you may be on a road to net zero, for example, yourself, So you would have collected the information, and the person in charge of net zero will be the person in charge of CBAM, and maybe the person in charge of, your ISO 14,000 or 9,000 if you're, so that's who it could be, is who is managing the information should manage CBAM, I recognize. But at the same token, you need to understand that they need support from across the organization. So the easiest way, I think, is to set up you've got a net zero ambitions, hopefully, and you're planning to do something about it. So that's where we develop a 7-step process. And then if you gather the information, then you have CBAM ready. It's just, and then if you've got that, then you go ISO ready. So that's the thing. I think the challenge is not to have 2 or 3 different part of the organizations working on that.
Okay,
and
thank you.
Having their own. So we are supporting businesses with pilot and developing templates, and that's what you want, the templates where the information is put and everything goes and pick and choose.
Got you. Thank you.
Any other question? I think the key thing for me is about being ready. That's my message usually, is be ready before you hurt, and that's what it's about. Ross, yeah?
Hi there. Good morning. Just a quick question. Do Scottish Engineering have any recommendations for a third-party service provider to help with the harvesting of the information?
Nobody that we would endorse specifically, but you'll see there is plenty. If you go on Google, you'll see plenty of organizations offering their support. The challenge, I think, what we've seen is ultimately the bulk of the work stays within the organizations, because the bulk of the work is about collecting data and putting data together. After that, the crunching of the data is pretty straightforward, I would argue. So that's why the challenge could be, do you have human resources to do it? But I say it's a big step to start with, because you want to set up your spreadsheets or your calculations, etc. But after that, I don't think it's that complex. So that's my view of it. But in terms of support, we don't have any organization that we would say go and work with them, but there are plenty of them online. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. It's just that also on this call, there'll be many companies with various headcount sizes, with various supply chain commitments. We've been already quoted some figures, ranging from $20,000 up to $50,000 per annum or per implementation. So, there are various companies out there who can provide, but they're also overseas. They're not based in UK, and we want to source a UK company if we can.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I understand that, even better if it was a Scottish company. But what I'm saying is just like, for that kind of prices or that kind of money, can you just get it done internally? What's stopping you? There is the EU has issued a tool for the importer to use when they register their certificate, or they request a certificate or register their CBAM product. So you can go in there and see what are they going to ask you. The question they're going to ask is limited compared to if you want what it will be for if you wanted to do a net zero, for example. If you were looking at your own emissions. But the whole idea, I think, is to try to do everything under one umbrella. So you collect the information and then you pick and choose in that information what you need for 14,000, and then, you know, net zero, and then CBAM, because it's all the same. Any other question? This is all you need. It's a lot simpler than net zero if you want, because your scope 3 are a lot simpler. Now, if I look also at steel, I was looking at that, is a lot of the steel in the UK is just about 50% is produced in the UK, and therefore under the UK ETS. And most of the import comes from Europe, therefore on the EU ETS. So that's where this, I think, becomes important, this carbon price here. And may have been paid abroad. So those are things to consider. And how you make your product cheaper, look cheaper to the importer. Okay, any other questions? So again, thank you for coming in. As mentioned, we provide support. So if you need either one-to-one online or visits, anything, then to look into further details on CBAM or net zero more broadly speaking, then I'm more happy to kind of help you. That's what we are here for, you know, plenty of support. Yeah, Peter.
Yeah, thanks for the information. We've already been contacted by one of our main customers. We're a sheet metal fabrication company with in excess of 500 different fabricated items that we supply this company with. Now, they have asked us to give the carbon footprint of each individual item that we produce. We laser profile, powder paint, press brake, weld. I'm not quite sure how I would go about identifying how much electricity or carbon footprint is used on each individual item, which is we normally do maybe 4 or 5 different times per month, 12 months a year. It's not as if we've got one product or a very limited amount of products. We've got, as I say, hundreds of different parts, and they're expecting us to identify that on an individual basis.
Yeah, so there is 2 sides to it. The first one would be the argumentation, does it apply, right? And because the easiest way for those customers is just to throw the ball over the wall and say, right, give me that information, I need to fill it in. And there may be a bit of education required here. And you may be, well, okay, you need that information, but look, we're not shipping at the moment more than, say, €150 per consignment, or we're not shipping more than 50 tons per year. So it doesn't apply. So that would be the first part of call. Does it actually apply? And then you've got your annex, etc. Now, let's say it all does apply and it's happening. Then you would start with a series of assumptions and you would just do a pro rata. So you know what you bring in, you know what comes out, and you know how much you've used to make all that out, and then you would just say, right, that's a product. So that thing, you know, weighs, I don't know, a kilo, and then we bought a ton, so that's 1,000, you know, so something like that. You could use things like that. Don't, if you try to go down to the nitty-gritty and put that's some electricity for that part and that's some electricity, you're just not going to get there.
Yes.
No,
They're expecting, actually. That's what they've came. I mean, we've kicked it back and says we don't have the knowledge for a start. We don't have the personnel. As an overall business, we could calculate the carbon footprint. We could have that data already, but on an individual basis, I think it's impossible.
Yeah, and that's not the way organization works. You know, like even them, you know, like when if you're trying to, they would face the same challenge, or they're probably going to you, because if you can achieve it, they're going to want to know how you do it, because they're going to want to use it.
Yeah.
You know, but I don't think that's what it is, and there is something about materiality. You know, so when you go and do those assessments and then you make a series of assumptions, and if you find out that those assumptions need to be validated, then that's a different story. But I would start by doing a pro rata scenario and see where you land, because you may not be far off what it is. There is a challenge, and the challenge is that how do you compare in terms of, you know, if someone else somewhere else come up with a different number, then are that customers going to start looking around and say, oh, I better go and change my supplier because they are greener, it costs me less CBAM or whatever. But the problem will be, how have they been calculated? You know, are you comparing apple with apple? So that's what you want to see, and that's why they put that EN and or ISO standard as a reference point, is that everybody should be measured against a given standard. So that's what you need to see if they come and start saying, well, I'm going to go somewhere else because that costs me less CBAM. So that's the challenge. So you do the pro rata, you see how you land, and if you feel like, oh, that's a bit scary, then you can look into your assumptions.
Okay, thank you very much.
Any other questions? It is not as daunting as it looks like. One of the things I'm trying to do is to demystify it all. And for any regulations, the first thing is, does it apply? And your customers are not more knowledgeable than you are, and they may need help in that. Any other questions, or should I close this webinar? I think it is time. So again, thank you all for coming and taking the time. I think we're due to stop 9:15. Again, support is available, so do not hesitate to contact Scottish Engineering or myself directly. And I'm happy to help with anything related to sustainability, net zero, CBAM, or regulations. Thank you very much for coming on and joining us.